Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with the National Weather Service. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather with us tonight on the 16th of January. As always, we're here to serve you for your weather needs around our last frontier state. And we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. There's a lot of different ways you can do that, whether it's Marine VHF or checking the internet, weather.gov/Alaska. A couple clicks will get you to your weather site there, and bookmark that on your tablet, your device. If you go to mobile.weather.gov, on your phone, and I know I've showed several folks in many communities around Alaska how to do this, but if you haven't done this yet, this is a really easy tool. It works whether you're on the way to Anchorage or if you're out in the bush and you've got a little bit of a cell signal. This is a great way to get the National Weather Service forecast on your phone. Simply type in mobile.weather.gov and then type in your city at the top. Once that forecast comes up, share that screen back to your home screen on your mobile device or your tablet, or even on your computer if you want to use some low bandwidth stuff on your PC, and it will act like an app. It is so much easier to use than the full website on a mobile device. So check that out if you haven't before, mobile.weather.gov. Now, of course, the Alaska Weather Information Line is always open, 1-800-472-0391, and if you can't find what you need, let me know, david.snyder@noaa.gov, and never fear if I don't reply to you right away, it's because of the shutdown. But I will get back to you just as soon as I possibly can, so never fear. Here's a look at what's going on in the hazardous weather picture around central and southern parts of southeast. We're still talking about dense fog. This is what we were talking about last night, and it looks like that is starting to break down a little bit, but the concern is that some of this may linger until about midnight or so tonight before it really starts to improve as we get into your Thursday. So don't be surprised if you run into a little bit more still on Thursday morning lingering around, but it looks like the issue will become a little bit more wind up across the northern parts of Lynn Canal, Haines, and Skagway down into Juneau. Probably looking for some strong winds showing up in your forecast, but maybe not in alert mode just yet. So be prepared for some changes there in southeast as we move ahead, moving away from dense fog eventually, and a little bit more into a breezier situation as we go. A look up north, you can still see plenty of yellow there for Fort Yukon, the Yukon Flats, all the way out toward Bettles and southward into the lower Tanana Valley. In this region, we're talking about winter weather advisories simply because of the wind blowing through. Looks like, wind advisories. Mainly some of the highways there, the Elliott, the Steese, we're dealing with some gusts up to about 40 miles per hour. So expecting to see some stronger winds blowing through the region for the next several hours there and in through tomorrow. So plan on kind of a blustery day as we go through tonight and into tomorrow, and certainly a wind chill that will be added on top of that, but nothing terribly significant beyond where it already is. Here's a look at the satellite picture today. You can see that broad east and southeasterly flow sweeping off of the lower 48 and western Canada. This is bringing another round of cloud cover into the eastern Gulf. You can see some of that up around Haida Gwaii. If I get out of the way, you can see even better. As you look around British Columbia, you can see some of that moisture working up. That's the next weather maker that's trying to come in, but really the big result that this is going to have is it's going to tighten up the pressure gradient from what you see in the Pacific Northwest to the high pressure system that's sitting up across western Canada. So that's going to mean a lot of air is working its way down the Lynn Canal again. So we're going to keep an eye on that, but plan on windier conditions again in southeast as we go. Across the interior, generally drier conditions here across the western interior. You can see kind of the speckled clouds here with cold air lingering around the Bering and a hint of the next weather system coming into the western chain. And then low pressure that's working its way right along the western part of Alaska. What that means is air is moving quickly across eastern sections of the Beaufort. And as we understand it, some of that wind again has swept away a little bit of the snow up around Kaktovik. Well, like I said, the good news is some of that wind should be subsiding, so that should not be a huge concern as much anymore. The tops of the Brooks Range there are certainly windy as we go. But the main weather focus for precipitation is probably going to be here across south and western Alaska, and then kind of snaking its way up the western coast over the next several days. Here's a look at the weather map right now. We've got a 1040 high up across western Canada. We're still looking at some dense fog across central and southern parts of southeast. Several fronts here that just kind of don't want to go anywhere just yet. And we've got colder air that's working its way in waves. As we go ahead in time, that front's going to fall apart as we get into tonight. Broken front here across the western sections of Bristol Bay and over the Alaska Peninsula, simply telling us that this boundary is really not going to stick with us very much longer. It's all kind of getting mixed up. High pressure sitting across the North Pacific is working in a stronger southerly flow across the western chain. You'll see some changes there as that happens, but an east and southeasterly flow is really the dominant feature for most of the last frontier for tonight and for tomorrow, and really as we go into your Thursday. Watch for a generally clear sky across most of the interior. The wind and the blowing snow will start to improve as we get across the eastern Beaufort Seacoast and even some of the eastern Brooks Range. For parts of Prince William Sound, we're still looking at some areas of rain. A lot of that's going to be falling closer to Seward, and as you go down the Kenai Fjords into Kodiak Island and the Pacific coast of the Alaska Peninsula, generally speaking, it's not going to be fairly widespread where a lot of people live. But for southwestern Alaska, this is going to be the main focus for any weather issues as we go into the next couple days there. It looks like low pressure will be hovering kind of in the same old area. Now, as we get up to the west coast, a better chance you'll see some light snow, and that could include places in the YK Delta all the way up toward generally north of Hooper Bay and into parts of the Norton Sound, Gallivan, and then west toward Nome. And then up towards Shishmaref and Kotzebue, still looking at some light snow there with low pressure parked out over the Chukchi ice. Out to the west, you can see that low pressure system hasn't changed very much with a high just south of Adak and Atka. Southeast, you can see a tight packing of the pressure gradient lines there. That's what we're talking about with kind of a wind generation issue there. And as we get into Friday, notice that tightens up even more. So as rain is moving in across the south, wouldn't be surprised to see the wind coming up across the Lynn Canal, Chatham Strait, and some of those long fetch areas there may have a couple of decent waves working through, so keep your watch on the marine forecast coming up as well. As you look at Cook Inlet down toward Shelikof Strait, Bristol Bay, all the way down the Bering Sea coast, it looks like we're still going to be looking at snow. A cold push of air coming inland will generate a band of snow, it looks like, around the YK Delta, up through the Koyukuk Valley and then into the Kobuk and Noatak valleys, all the way up through Shishmaref, Kivalina. North side of that, probably some fog as the snow winds down, and probably looking at some patchy fog at least across the southern parts of the Bering Sea. It really goes without saying, right? It's wintertime in the Bering. And low pressure out across the west, 970 millibars there. Another push of colder air working its way across the central and western chain. Doesn't look like we're going to move into a very significant snowy pattern for parts of south central, but out ahead of that, certainly could be an easterly flow working through the central and eastern parts of south central and the interior, keeping things generally dry. Take a look at Thursday morning temps real quick. 20s and 30s in southeast, 20s to about 30 in south central, almost 40 in Kodiak, 11 below in Fairbanks, almost 30 below in Fort Yukon, and 5 to 10 below for the North Slope, certainly warming up there. Teens for Kotzebue Sound, teens and 20s for Norton Sound. Bristol Bay temps in the 20s and 30s, Nunivak Island and Bethel about 15, 23 in St. Paul, mid-20s for Adak and Atka. High temperatures for your Thursday then. Oh, not much warmer in Fort Yukon, 22 below, 2 above for Utqiagvik, 2 for Kaktovik, 2 above for Wainwright. Teens and 20s for Kotzebue Sound, same goes for Norton Sound. South Central temps back in the 20s and 30s. Kodiak's to 42, King Salmon 41, Southeast in the 20s to almost 40 degrees in Sitka.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And moving on to your aviation weather now, a large swath of the Brooks Range will see pretty decent improvement over the last several days there. It looks like VFR conditions to start us off tomorrow morning all the way down into the Koyukuk Valley and the middle Yukon Valley, but on either end we're still dealing with fairly widespread MVFR and in some cases IFR as you head up into parts of the upper Tanana Valley there toward between Eagle and Northway. Out across the YK coastline and certainly inland up toward Bethel, you'll be looking at least MVFR, and just south of you into some of the higher terrain there, you're looking at IFR conditions. Some of that will stretch into the Alaska Peninsula. The windward side, you can see the effects of that wet air coming in from the east and southeast. Look at the Alaska Range here, all the way down toward the Chignik Chunk, and across the Seward Peninsula, or the Kenai Peninsula on the Seward side there in Resurrection Bay, you're looking at IFR conditions there where the wind again is hitting the mountains and creating a little bit more cloud cover. Not a whole lot going on in southeast. Probably looking at some occasional patchy fog there, but right now no sense that that's going to turn into widespread dense fog just yet. As you look at areas across the upper Tanana Valley and the upper Yukon, once again looking at widespread MVFR developing, and we'll see some patchy MVFR developing around the north slope, Nuiqsut, AKwx, up toward Utqiagvik, and maybe as far west as Wainwright before that starts to break up a little bit. Down the west coast, MVFR fairly widespread, and for St. Paul and St. George, look for that to continue. As we get into Friday morning, IFR is back across parts of southwest, but pretty hit and miss across the west coast. You'll be a lot more likely to run into MVFR than anything else. And the widespread VFR that we saw across the interior for Thursday morning, that's filled in quite a bit. You'll notice IFR also developing across some of the higher terrain, closer to Dehne Pass and around the Brooks Range. MVFR starts to fill in. Still, things look fairly okay for southeast, though by the afternoon that changes quickly. All the way from Juneau southward toward Ketchikan and Annette, Craig, Klawock, and out towards Sitka, with isolated IFR even around Port Alexander and Sitka itself, so keep watch on that. And look for IFR to hang around parts of southwest Kodiak Island. Hit and miss MVFR across west and southwestern Alaska, and south central starts to fill in just a little bit more. Up around Kotzebue Sound, look for MVFR conditions inland a little bit more, and more widespread conditions changing there for the north slope. Here's your pass conditions for tomorrow, though. For right now, Anaktuvik and Anigan Pass look to be VFR, so good news and get through it if you can. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass, IFR to start in the morning, MVFR conditions developing by the afternoon. We'll see a similar trend in Rainy Pass. Windy Pass, marginal conditions throughout your Thursday. Isabel Pass looking for IFR to start, and similar conditions there. And Mentasta Pass, a little bit more toward the MVFR side as we get into the afternoon. Marginal conditions for Tenita Pass. Looking for that to continue into Portage Pass, probably an IFR start there as well, especially on the Prince William Sound side. The western side should be okay. And Chilkoot and White Pass, safe for some patchy morning fog right now, looking like VFR for your Thursday. Now with the freezing levels, the warm air from the south and east is working its way over the Alaska Range, up the west and the central interior coasts, and out across parts of the northwestern coast. Levels there at least 2,000 feet, and in some cases inside that range, we're seeing some isolated areas up to 4,000 feet. You can see that 4,000 foot line a little bit more solidly anchored across southern southeast and out across the central Gulf. The surface freezing line, though, dipped below and south of Adak and Atka for now. Icing potential is starting to come up as well, as you would expect with that warmer air above 5,000 feet around the Bering Strait communities and northwestern Alaska. For southwest, levels as high as 8 to maybe even pushing 9,000 feet as you get out across the western Gulf. So right now, isolated moderate seems to be the best rule. The upper Yukon Valley and into Canada, levels there above 2,000 feet. Some of that sneaking into areas around Glen Allen and Gulkana. Out west, also warmer air coming in on the south wind for the western chain, above 7,000 feet there. The superhighway of weather is well south of us, though it does have a few off-ramps trying to work their way into Alaska. You can see a ridge of high pressure, mostly trying to build over the interior, but the main corridor of fast-moving air is right here across the central and northern Pacific and moving its way back into the western parts of the lower 48 at 135 knots. 9,000 feet, we have east to westerly flow across the Gulf right now. Wind speed's fairly tame for most areas, but high pressure is pushing a northerly flow through the interior. Light winds for southeast and more of a southerly flow for areas north of Nunivak Island. Generally light winds around 3,000 feet. Again, an east to westerly flow over the Gulf, 15 to as strong as 30 knots there. 5 to about 20 knots across the interior, east to west, and a little bit of a southerly flow developing for the west coast with a ridge of high pressure just to the south of the Aleutians. Strong winds developing there in the west, and that's where we'll see turbulence below 4,000 feet. Considerable moderate possible there, especially for the eastern chain, the Alaska Peninsula, up through Lake Iliamna and some of the higher terrain in the west, and also hit and miss across the west coast and the north slope.
Leatherbacks are the largest turtles on Earth, growing up to 7 feet long and weighing more than 2,000 pounds. These sea turtles are among the most highly migratory animals on Earth, some traveling up to 10,000 miles a year between their nesting and feeding grounds. Prevalent in every ocean except the Arctic and Antarctic, the species overall is declining, more so in the Pacific. In the eastern Pacific, the Mexican population was once thought to be the largest in the world and has experienced an alarming decline.
This trajectory of decline that we've seen and actually collapse. We're talking about only 20 or 30 turtles nesting every year, where thousands used to just 40 years ago. That's the kind of dramatic decline.
The Western Pacific population has been declining steadily, and it's particularly critical to act now before it collapses, while there are enough turtles and nests to respond to conservation measures. But threats to all leatherbacks in the Pacific need to be addressed.
The top threats to populations are uncontrolled coastal development, all the bad stuff on the nesting beaches, egg harvest, poaching of the females, predation on the eggs by dogs and pigs. Deforestation makes the sand too warm and dry and the eggs don't hatch. Another one is incidental capture in fishing gear. During their vast migrations, they get caught in fishing gear throughout the Pacific. And finally, marine debris, which the leatherbacks mistake for their favorite food, jellyfish, and they choke on those.
Protecting leatherbacks in U.S. waters alone is not enough to ensure the continued existence of the species. The highly migratory nature of Pacific leatherbacks requires cooperation and international collaboration. NOAA is focusing on partnerships with Mexico, Central America, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands in the Pacific.
Our action plan promotes a holistic recovery strategy that addresses all the sources of mortality. So that's basically ensuring that the remaining nesting sites are protected. And the nests produce as many hatchlings as possible. And then secondly, in tandem with that, is reducing the fisheries-related mortalities. We're working with international partners to incentivize community participation on the nesting beach conservation and developing alternative livelihood programs that wean communities off leatherback resources and introduce alternative methods for food and income. Recovery is going to take a long time, on the order of 20 to 30 years at least, before we see some of these actions bear fruit. But here in the US, we can all help leatherbacks by making seafood choices, for instance, that support sustainable fishing practices. And beachgoers can certainly do their part by keeping our oceans clean of plastic debris, picking up marine litter, particularly plastic bags.
Together with our partners, we are strengthening protection and conservation efforts to ensure a future for leatherbacks, helping them to survive and once again thrive in the waters of the Pacific Ocean.
For over 40 years, NOAA scientists have been collecting data and piecing together the story of the gray whale. Each year, new discoveries are made, revealing the secrets of this ancient traveler. With the northeastern Pacific population recovered, leading scientists from the NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center continue their research efforts to help save the western population from extinction. The most effective way to identify individuals and count the population is to photograph them from the surface. Using the gray whale's distinctive markings and gray spots caused by parasites on their skin, scientists document these characteristics to identify individuals.
So we're able to track migratory pathways and corridors by the simple use of photo identification. There are other ways to do that as well, biopsy sampling and genetics.
And from the air.
Aerial photography is one way you can study animals based on their size and shape. So you can learn a lot about nutritive and reproductive condition of whales just by measuring their size and shape from vertical aerial photographs.
You can also put satellite transmitters on them and track them remotely. You put the transmitter on and let them go, and you watch them move across the Pacific or down to China or wherever it might be.
To further learn and discover where these great sojourners swim, The team of researchers traveled to Russia and set up camp on Sakhalin Island.
The main focus of our research while we were on Sakhalin was to collect photo identification. If it was a whale that we had not collected a genetic sample from previously, we would also attempt to collect a sample from the whales.
Whereas whales are endowed with natural insulation, their human observers must gear up to brave the cold in order to study these marine giants up close.
We're typically only able to work about 1/3 of the time that we're there, and that's mostly due to this fog that just invades the area and sits sometimes for weeks on end. So it can be very challenging to try and do field work in this site.
Recently, 2 whales from the western population surprised scientists by migrating across the Pacific to the waters of California and Mexico.
It's a really fun finding. It's added another piece to the puzzle that we didn't previously know about. And I would have to say that it's opened up more questions than we had before.
Research scientists from Japan, Russia, and the United States share images of animals they've spotted.
We take a photograph of an individual off of Sakhalin Island, and we get a phone call from Japanese scientists, and they say, hey, guess what? We've got a picture of a gray whale in Japan. We say, can you send it to us? We'd love to try and match it. They'll send us the picture, we'll compare it to our catalog, and we'll say, hey, we've got a match from Sakhalin to Japan.
Unlike many species of whales that still remain on the endangered species list, the eastern Pacific gray whale, once on the brink of extinction, now numbers about 20,000 individuals. Recovery efforts that started 40 years ago and the ongoing research and monitoring by NOAA scientists have contributed to the conservation of the gray whales. Together, with legal protection and public education, scientists are playing their part to ensure the survival of this magnificent migratory animal.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And on to your marine weather now. We're looking at sea ice that is pulling away a little bit from the YK coastline down into the Kuskokwim Delta, and not a whole lot of change right now around Bristol Bay, but you can see that persistent and sometimes strong south and easterly wind blowing out of Norton Sound, and especially off the Yukon Delta down into Etolan Strait. You'll notice a little bit more marginal ice in there as a result of that. Now there is shore-fast ice, which is good news, but the further out you go from that, you're going to start to run into some thinner ice and maybe less concentrated ice for sure, assuming that that's what we're seeing here as of the 16th of January. Now, if you're tracking the proximity to St. Matthew, it's about 35 to about 40 nautical miles to get to the main ice pack there, the higher concentration ice. And I think we're still looking at about 150 miles or so north and east of St. Paul. So still a ways to go, but it is closing in on St. Matthew slowly and surely. No big changes though in the near future. Here's a look at what we see in southeast. Winds are going to come up here as the pressure gradient tightens up across the north. Still looking at fog in the morning, extending from Juneau southward, it looks like, down into the central and southern parts of the inside waters, of course. North and easterly winds there, anywhere from 10 knots to 35 knots in the north, 7-foot seas up north, and an offshore flow for the outer coast, anywhere from 15 to 25 knots with seas 7 to 10 feet. Friday, northerlies continue there, a little bit less wind, but not too much of a change. 25 to 30 knots out of the north with 5-foot seas in most areas, 2-foot seas in the Clarence Strait. Offshore winds continue from Yakutat to Craig, 20 to 25, and seas ranging from 8 to about 12 feet there on Friday. For Thursday in Cook Inlet, northeasterlies 20 to 25, 5 to 6-foot seas as you head further south, northwesterlies in Prince William Sound, and northeasterlies across the northern Gulf anywhere from 15 to 25, 7-foot seas outside of Resurrection Bay. For Friday, winds diminish a little bit in the northern Gulf, still holding up there around Hitchinbrook entrance and outside of Prince William Sound, 20 knots with a 5-foot sea. Light winds, small seas in Prince William Sound itself, and north and easterly winds diminish ever so slightly inside of Cook Inlet, 20 knots with a 5-foot sea on Friday. For Bristol Bay, 20 knots over the ice with a 4-foot sea as you head a little bit further west of Port Hayden. Again, watch for heavy freezing spray in some areas. Northerlies north of Cold Bay with a 15-foot sea. North and easterly winds coming around Kodiak Island, 25 knots with 9-foot seas, 8-foot seas from Sandpoint south and west down the coast. For Friday, the higher seas move a little bit further west toward the eastern Aleutians there. You'll notice those levels coming up to about 15 feet in some cases. We'll see the next map in a moment. North and easterly winds over Kodiak Island, down the Pacific coast and the Bering Sea coast. The strongest winds and highest seas will be north of Cold Bay and south and west of Port Huyton there. It looks like about 5 to about 14-foot seas as you go down the coast there. Again, watch out for heavy freezing spray. There are the winds we were watching there on Thursday. Northerlies into the eastern chain around Dutch Harbor and Unalaska, 35 knots with a 14-foot sea. Much stronger on the leeward side of the range, 40 knots with a 13-foot sea on the other side of the hill, so watch for some stronger gusts there. Out across the west, southerlies coming up across the western chain, 30 to 40 knots with 8 to as high as 18-foot seas as you approach Shemya. As we get into Friday, you can see why. Southeasterly winds feeding into the next weather maker there as the front approaches, 40 knots develop. 18 to 22-foot seas in the west and sneaking their way past Kiska toward Adak. You'll notice the Pacific coast looking at 10 to 12-foot seas there with winds 20 to 35, and about the same there across the central and eastern chain of the Bering Sea coast with a little bit more of a northerly flow coming in at 35 knots and 15-foot seas from Nikolsky to Unalaska and Dutch Harbor. For the west coast, ice is in place for Norton Sound all the way down into the Kuskokwim Delta, but remember, some of that is marginal. West and northwesterly winds there, 10 to 15 knots, 20 knots into northern sections of Nunivak Island, 25 knots and 9-foot seas for St. Paul and St. George. Mind the heavy freezing spray. And look for southerlies coming into St. Lawrence Island, 15 knots over the ice. Northeasterlies blowing out of the Kuskokwim Delta, again helping to enhance that marginal ice zone likely. Again, 30 knots with a 6-foot sea in the open waters and 25 knots and 9-foot seas for St. Paul and St. George. For the north slope, easterlies over the Beaufort, 15 to 35 again, so blowing winds and some poor visibility from time to time as possible. Southeasterlies over the Chukchi, 15 knots there. Southerlies north of St. Lawrence Island through the Bering Strait, and southwesterlies developing 10 to 15 over the Chukchi, with easterlies still going strong across the Beaufort, anywhere from 15 to 30. Recapping tonight's weather, watch for dense fog across the central and southern parts of southeast, maybe as far north as Juneau again. A dense fog advisory is posted at least until midnight. We're going to see some pockets of freezing rain around the Anchorage area, so watch yourself if you're driving through town. And out west, well, we've got a wind advisory across some parts of the interior. Not a whole lot of wind so much in the west, but it does look like you might have a blustery situation around the Elliott and the Steese highways there for the upper Tanana and eastward across the Yukon Flats. As we look toward Thursday and Friday, watch for another front to move into the west coast. Thanks for watching.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.